said Lee's military secretary, Colonel Charles, well, let's see, I should get that for sure. Well, Lee's military secretary reviewed the heroic nature of Lee, and its theme was, and this is what I think should be put in all of them, this statue will perpetuate no memory of infidelity to the Union as it was, and will teach no lesson inconsiderate with a loyal and cheerful obedience to the authority of the Union as it is.
What does that mean?
Wrote a personal essay monument, 'cause it was white and pretty. My kitchen was also white and pretty, so made it and hope they let me in. Both of you didn't say anything, that's how it's been. We didn't say anything that seemed real, to face our southern ghosts and white guilt I felt from head to toe. I peered into a clear view where conflict was a rhapsody. Write a note to everyone I know so I can love them honestly.
Washington that you're looking at now is by Edward Virginius Valentine, and we have his sculpture studio with many of his maquettes and tools and project pieces there that I hope you'll take some time looking at. You'll see a number of pieces related to this larger story. So, in addition to this, we created a series of drawers that have additional artifacts related to Monument Avenue. So, as we always look to balance our stories, we were able to partner this particular drawer with the original early Emancipation Day celebrations by the African American community here in town. And here's a wonderful image from the archives of an April 1888 celebration. And of course, this 1915 pin back button for the 50th. And as you look around, you'll see sort of every piece is sort of telling a different story, with this sort of early image from the archives of the Confederate Pyramid at Hollywood, which was the sort of first, and then this wonderful image here that you'll probably see more closely today in the materials you're looking through with Meg, which is Monument Avenue. We still had the opportunity to talk to Helen Marie Taylor, who's 94, I think now, or 96. And she's the woman on Monument Avenue
Who stood in front
quite
of
famously.
Stood in front of the table. She was just featured in this week's Style Weekly. Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
The people or things we love.
She still lives in her house on Monument Avenue, and she stood in front of the city hall about 2 weeks ago. It was in the paper, where she stood up to talk about the monuments and the need to expand the story. So she's still very much involved and engaged in a journey, and I think that was 1969 when she made her great stand.
So, should we move into start?
I think so. I have a couple objects I just wanted to show you that relate to Monument Avenue.
Hello? Hi. We're students from the University of Richmond, and we saw a article in Style Weekly about Miss Helen Marie Taylor. We wanted to do an interview with her.
All right, let me write this down. What is your name?
My name, it's V-I, and then
I'm
Trinh.
sorry, your name is what?
V,
I'm not hearing that.
V, like the letter V.
V.
Yeah. And then Trinh, T-R-I-N-H.
I'm still not hearing you. Is your name V, just the initial V?
Yeah.
And your last name is?
Trinh, T-R-I-N-H.
Are you saying T-R-I-N-E?
H.
I'm not hearing you.
Oh, sorry. T
T-R-I-N-E?
N H. H S. No E.
Well, what's the last letter in your name?
The sound levels look.
On here?
Glad to have a mind around you.
Are they on?
Yeah, it's on.
Great.
But it might be. This might be coming. You should hit that real quick. Yeah, that's good.
It seemed like it was.
And just talk a little bit.
You didn't
Hey, Joseph.
put it over there,
Yeah.
Kasia.
What's going on?
Get some headphones so I can hear it, right?
Yeah. Do you?
It was in 1969, and my son came running in and said, "Mom, there's a great big machine coming down the street." And I thought, uh-huh. So I went straight to the phone, and I called and asked to speak to Alan Keeper, the city manager. I told him I'm Mrs. Jacqueline Taylor, and I live at 2325 Monument, and I'm calling about my concern that work is being done on the street. But he'd already given the order. And I said, all right, if you don't stop it, I will. Now, wait just a minute. And what are you going to do? I said, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I won't hesitate to go out there and rope myself or chain myself to the Jefferson Davis Monument. And if I do, you're going to get some publicity that you're not going to favor. And he said, now, wait just a minute. I'll see you this afternoon at 2 o'clock. I said, no, sir. You have to stop this work right now within 5 minutes. Well, I can't do that. It has to be an hour. I said, Mr. Keeper, I'm telling you, 5 minutes is it. He said, I'll call you back. Well, he did call back within 5 minutes. And what he said was, I've given the order to stop the work at the first feasible point. Now, I didn't like the sound of that first feasible point because you could pave the whole of Monument Avenue in about 45 minutes on one side, and then, of course, you'd have to do the other. But I didn't argue about that. By that time, I had on my dress, and I came running down here and went outside, left my front door open, and here was the poor fellow up on this great big machine. And I waved to him, and I said, I've left my front door open, and you're either free to go in and make a call to City Hall or your foreman, but this work has been stopped. No, ma'am. I got a work order this morning to pave this street, and I've got to pave this street. And this is when I put my arms out and said, no, I'm sorry, you can't go any further. Well, the good Lord is in heaven, you know. Who should be driving down the street but a photographer for the Richmond newspaper? And he sees this lady standing there in front of this big machine like this. So he pulls over to the curb, and he grabs his camera and jumps out and says, lady, turn around. So I turned around like that, And he snapped that picture, me telling him what was going on. He said, wonder if a picture in the paper would do any good. I said, it couldn't hurt. So this is what launched it. But what was it, 600,000 people lost their lives in this slave, now considered slave issue. At that time, it was as much a states' rights. It was that when we had the union of the states, they each reserved a certain sovereignty. And they felt in the South that they had an imposition from the other end of the country. But here was the thing that was so sad. The founding fathers that they're all now saying, somebody asked, well, what about George Washington? And he said, well, why not? Tear down Mount Vernon. He was a slave owner. And what do you care about the Constitution? Don't care about it. It was written by a bunch of slave owners, so tear it up and start over again. And these are people who, well, I'll be charitable and say that they don't have a good understanding of history, and I oppose them very vigorously. My grandmother used to say, well, daughter, there was no justification for slavery, whatever. It was morally indefensible. It was an economic failure. We felt that it was going to phase out.
Do you think anything needs to change to kind of reflect our current attitudes and feelings?
Nothing should change. Not at all. What should be added is more monuments. More monuments. To continue. Now, I've lived here.
If you were to add a monument, actually, who would you add a monument of?
Well, I've said before in some of these hearings, I've lived here for 50 years now, and I've lived here long enough to see the efforts that Virginia has made to seek a more perfect union. And I think they have a lot to be proud of, and it hasn't been easy. As my grandmother said, when I was, 18 and thought I'd discovered racial prejudice, and very upset about it, she said, well, dear, we have worked out our destiny together, and it has not been easy. I felt like, even when I was on the commission, that it would be good to phase out the Confederacy and go towards Matthew Fontaine Maury, Pathfinder of the Seas. I felt that Richard Evelyn Byrd, with his polar expedition and successes, that he should have had a monument. I personally like Chuck Wilder as a governor. I am not a Democrat, I'm a Republican, and a conservative Republican, a Reagan Republican. But whether you do or you don't, the fact is that Virginia elected the first black governor in the United States. Chuck ought to have a statue. There are other statues to be added to show that we have been seeking a more perfect union, and it's not to tear down what's there, but to add to, and keep on adding to.
Yeah, and this is odd that it's a dead end too. Usually these houses are a full circle. There's no door over there.
The stairway doesn't go anywhere?
It goes up to the nursery. It probably wasn't here in the 1750s, but she's a woman with like 8 kids. Her husband's just died, and the nursery's upstairs. So she probably had that installed in the 1760s or 1770s to keep a closer eye on her kids, more or less.
Well, I think that kind of concept starts in a place like this, the idea of the landed Virginia gentry, those first families of Virginia. So you get this beginnings of the concept of being a Virginian as being somebody who is wealthy, who is landed, who has this sense of just a life of decadence, but we tend to look past the truth that is grounded completely in large-scale slavery. So I think that by thinking of it as an aesthetic nobility, especially when you look at things like monuments, you've got that cold marble, that cold stone. It allows you to look at it without blemish and to interact with it in a way that allows you to look past its dirty history and take it in just as an aesthetic. It allows us to become disconnected with our own past. And a lot of that, I think, has been purposeful. When you look at groups of memory after the Civil War, the Confederate Memorial Literary Society, or the Daughters of the Confederacy, there's a real push to try to memorialize this lost idea of the South, the lost cause, without really getting into the nitty-gritty of what that meant and what it was really like. Political boycotts, they're the only women listed on it, so I found that really interesting. So that's badass. Yeah, that might be why George Washington comes here. When he goes to St. John's Church for the Give Me Liberty, Give Me Death, he stays here for 3 days. But I think when it comes to the preservation of structures, you have to pay attention to what's being preserved and what wasn't. This house was preserved specifically because it was owned by a wealthy landholding family, but none of the outbuildings, none of the quarters for the enslaved families, none of that was preserved. So when we make the choice to retain architecture, that architecture is symbolic of something. So certainly I think that monuments and building can be a monument in many ways. When people grow up and they're taught history and they learn history, they sort of observe that into their personal narratives and psyche. So that if you challenge somebody's long-held historical beliefs, it's like you're challenging a part of them. It's not necessarily their fault if they're raised on a textbook that tells them that this was a glorious past, but once you challenge that understanding, you're challenging their entire personhood. So I found it the first time in my life when dealing with, especially with Confederate history, it's the first time that I've seen people get personally offended when you try to correct basic historical narratives.
How do you deal with confronting those kinds of people, though?
I think you have to be empathetic, first off. You have to understand where those beliefs come from and address them at the root. You have to understand that when you're talking about this kind of history, you're talking about people's, especially in Virginia, their personal ancestors, their personal stories. So you have to find a way to approach that in a way that's understanding, that's thoughtful and caring, but also makes them a little uncomfortable. I hear a lot of people say, well, I don't want to be uncomfortable when I come to a museum, but there's a way to be uncomfortable and have that in a more progressive or a productive conversation as well.
This is just a little excerpt from it, but I think this is what should be added for anybody that comes here to visit the monuments and to look at them, you know. It said, it said, well, Lee's military secretary reviewed the heroic nature of Lee, and its theme was, and this is what I think should be put in all of the, this statue will perpetuate no memory of infidelity to the Union as it was, and will teach no lesson inconsiderate with a loyal and cheerful obedience to the authority of the Union as it is.
What does that mean?
It means that they would not perpetuate what the Confederacy had fought for,
Okay.
but that they were pledging fidelity to the Union. Now, how could you come forward with any more positive or less trying to hold back, the past.
Why is it moving on to make a monument to something that happened in the past?
You're not moving on to. You're preserving the monuments of the past as you move forward to show how you're continuing to work for a more perfect union.
So the idea is to show something that happened in the past that maybe wasn't good, so that you can show as you get better. No.
You learn from that. You go by and look at it. And you say, well, that's what they were fighting for. They say states' rights. It's now said almost totally for slavery.
What do you think?
Both. Both. My great-grandfather, who owned slaves, said, there was a law, once the emancipation was passed, you had to read it. You had to call all the slaves that you owned and read it to them. And he said, I never bought a slave in my life. I never sold a slave in my life. I inherited my black family. And if they think that this scrap of paper is going to erase my responsibility to them, they are wrong. They're still my family. He had a wife and one little son, and my grandfather. And so he went back to Arkansas, and he called all the slaves together, and his cousin, who lived in an adjoining plantation, offered to buy the slaves for $200,000 in gold at the wrong end of the war. And he left it up to the slaves to decide whether they wanted to come with the family to Texas or stay there and become a part of the adjoining plantation. And they said, they wanted to come to Texas, and they didn't want to leave the family. So they came to Texas, and they hated Texas. It was hot, and they didn't have their old friends, and they were living not in the nice quarters and then with the big red house with the columns. They were all living in log cabins. And my great-grandfather said one of the greatest compliments of his life that he treasured the most was that every one of them, 159, took the name Taylor. Not one single person took another name. He said you could almost always find somebody that was a field worker that was mad about something, but not them. Well, grandmother would tell me about when the slaves were leaving, her nurse, a black nurse who took care of her and her little sister, she said, now Sally, I don't want you lighting the candles. Don't want you lighting the lamp. I've put rose petals in your drawer and the lilac ones on your little sister's drawer, so you can just open the drawers and you can smell which drawers are yours. They were just little, 3, 4, 5 years old. And she said, we loved going down to the slave quarters because they always had one of these big black pots. And the pots were filled with black-eyed peas. And she said, we liked the juice from the black, and there was a dipper there. And anybody could just come by and drink a dipper of the... And she said, and we had corn pones roasting around the bottom. And she said, and we liked those too, except Nurse would always put them in her mouth and chew them up, and then she'd put them in our mouths. And we preferred to eat them just like they were. And so and then one day there was a robin's nest outside her window, and she said, daughter, come here. When I say that the slaves were closer to nature than we were, you remember my telling you that Nurse, she would chew up the corn pones in her mouth and put them in our mouths, and we didn't really like that. But she said, look at this robin. And there was the mother coming, and there's the little birds' little mouths were wide open, and she was putting the food in their mouths. And she said, you see, they were closer to nature. It was pre-digesting the food for us. It made it easier for us, as she felt. And when my father was a lawyer, he said, Lord, in the Depression era, nobody had any money. But he said, as the descendant, all of the blacks expected him to do anything that had to do with the law, naturally not charging them anything, because they didn't expect him ever to charge them anything. You know, monuments are our history. Our history. I don't care whether you like the history, you don't like the history. You save our history to learn from our history. Not to celebrate it, but to learn from it.
That seems like a hard line to, like, I personally am thinking about that, like, you know, you have to be empathetic and you have to meet these people where they're at, but also toe that line of, like, I want this experience to challenge you and, like, maybe slightly start to shift a paradigm. Do you have any questions for us? You know?
Well, you're art majors, you're going to school for art. How do you view the aesthetics of Monument Avenue in the future? Where is that point where aesthetics overcomes the intentionality of that monument?
Wow, that is an amazing question.
I heard that all the time.
Yeah.
They're beautiful, we have to keep them.
I guess. I guess if I have to speak to it, I mean, I think it's like the aesthetics. I guess I'm in my education. I'm realizing how much like aesthetics have power. Like aesthetics demonstrate power, and they demonstrate hegemony and all kinds of things. And so I guess, I mean, despite the fact that some people view them as beautiful and they're like this aesthetic, they create this aesthetic stateliness on Monument Avenue. I think I would want them to be more challenging. Like, there's something to be said for beauty, but there's also something to be said for things that strike you in a different way. And I think that's what they should do.
I think all aesthetics, no matter how beautiful they are, they always need to be surrounded by context. Because even a beautiful thing can be kind of difficult. Because when I'm walking down Monument Avenue, I also think it's aesthetically pleasing, you know, but like there's that huge conflict inside of me that's just like, wait, you find it aesthetically pleasing, but at the same time you know this history. Because like I'll drive down there and I'll be like, it's such a nice drive down, look at all these trees.
Yeah, exactly.
But like on the inside I'll be like, but am I complicit in enjoying the aesthetic? So it's difficult for sure.
I thought about this a lot when I lived right behind the Jefferson Davis Monument. And I walked by it with my dog every single morning, and it's something that I kind of struggled with. I had this moment where I stopped and the light hit it perfectly, and I thought, oh wow, what a great shot, I should take that picture. And then I sort of reeled myself in and said, well, it's beautiful, but it's the light bouncing off of Vindicatress, the woman topping the monument, who's the sign of the vindication of the South. So when I look at the idea of context, my recommendations in my op-ed was knock down the 60-foot tall column, because it's a symbol of power, it's a symbol of potency. It's not meant for something you to learn from, it's something specifically to revere. That's something I've tried to point out about Monument Avenue, especially when people would ask me directions. How do I get there? What should I see? I would have to warn them, you can't approach them. They're not meant for approachability. You're not meant to interact with them in any meaningful way. You go to a monument anywhere else and you can get close to it, you can read it, you can interact with it. If you go to DC, these memorials are somber, they're places of remembrance. Stonewall Jackson is in the middle of traffic. It's something you gotta, it's an obstacle. It's not something you're supposed to interact with.
What your heart can't find words to, and just laugh, 'cause there is nothing better. Spend my time defending you to her, spent my time defending her to you. My heart knew what my mind couldn't